Okay. Okay. Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I know it's Friday and I know it's the weekend, so I'm going to try to get to the materials quickly. And if there's any questions, by all means, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to address it. So today's topic, we're going to be discussing the new purchase agreement, the RPA. Um, Twice a year, first one in June, second one in December, they usually do a revised agreements. Either they add new forms, they remove new forms, or they do revisions to certain, forms. Today's form is the residential purchase agreement. They made a significant change to my liking. They have removed the SBPP form from the checkbox G2. So I'm going to dive deep into the purchase agreement. But as you all know, there is disclosures that are provided as part of the process, right? Which is your disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship, better known as the AD form. Okay, let me make sure I get some of these agents on the call. All right, so pretty self-explanatory. Nothing significant with the agency disclosure. Okay. So let me move this here. Why is this not? Okay. All right. So we go into the residential purchase agreement. Okay. So what you want to make sure that, one second, that you're using the most current form, which says car form RPA revised December 2024. Okay. December 2024. That is the latest form uh, that CAR has created. It's pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to go through the motions. Today is the December. So let's say, for example, you're submitting an offer, right? Let's see. How do we got everyone on? Yeah. All right. So you're going to put buyer number one, buyer number two as an example, right? So that's where the buyer's information. Now the subject property. Okay. And then what city? I'm just going to pull San Pedro as an example. The county of Los Angeles, and then your local zip code. All right, the APN number, we're just going to put a APN number just for training purposes. Okay, that would be the APN number. It's basically the social security to the property. Okay. So this is the first initial section of paragraph one is the initial offer. Who are the buyers? What's the subject property? What city, what county, zip code, and the APN number or the tax ID. Then we go down to agency. Question? Do we have a question? Okay, let me make sure we meet people. Okay. Now we go into the agency portion of it, disclosure and confirmation. Seller's broker firm. This is where you're going to put the listing agents. Okay. Listing agents firm. Okay, you're going to put that the listing agent is representing the seller. Okay. And then you're going to put yourself as the buyer's agent here. Okay, and that would be Keller Williams. as an example that you represent the buyer, right? And then you would put you as the buyer's agent. Okay. Then you need to verify their license. That would be the firm or the real estate company's DRE license. Then there would be the agent's license. It would be your company's license, and then it would be your personal real estate license as an example. Okay. You represent the buyer. You're submitting the offer. Oops, 1 second here. Uh, 1 second, guys. Let me try to admit some people in here. I guess we have 4 people waiting to admit everyone. Okay. This is when you need someone else to help you with Zoom and you're trying to do it all by yourself. Okay, I think they're joining. Everyone on Zoom, can you still see the purchase agreement?
Nope, we only see you. Happy holidays, Simon.
Okay. Happy holidays. Something happened. I'm having some, let's see, let's try one more time. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay, awesome. All right, I'm still in the very beginning of the purchase agreement. I went ahead and did section 1, section 2, listing agent's firm's name, and then your information. Now we get into what's called the section number 3, which is the terms of the purchase agreement and any allocation cost. Okay, so from here, this is the grid that we're so accustomed and so familiar with. This section here is where you're going to put the actual offer that your clients would like to submit. Okay. If it's a cash offer, then you would click this. If they're going to go a traditional direction, then obviously if they're going to get conventional FHA, VA, then you will not check the all cash. Close of escrow, you want to click on here. You want to put a minimum of 30 days, depending on the lender's approach and how fast they can get the loan approval, right, will dictate your close of escrow. So to always play it safe, you always want to do at least a minimum of 30 days. But in negotiations, you might be able to navigate that. Again, speaking with the lender may say, look, we can get it knocked out in 20 days, 25 days. Then you just go with the rhythm of what the lender is willing to, press upon the buyer to get the necessary approval, funding, and ultimately close the deal. But your typical is 30-day escrow. Now, all this is subject to modifications. You can extend or you can close sooner, but that's again conversations with the listing agent to make sure that the buyer and the seller are all on the same page. Okay. Or if you want to have a specific date, then you can click here and then you can put a specific date. I just try to keep it very simplistic. Expiration of the offer. Okay, the expiration of the offer is already defaulted to 3 calendar days. Okay, 3 calendar days. It doesn't say business days, 3 calendar days. So that goes into the Saturdays or even the holidays. So let's say, for example, you submitted an offer on Sunday, right? And then we knew that Christmas was Wednesday, right? So Monday would be 1 day, Tuesday would be 2 days, and then on Christmas Day, right, would be the 3rd day. If the offer was not considered or countered, then ultimately you would have a expired offer on Christmas Day. Okay, it's calendar days. It doesn't necessarily go in effect like it would be a contingency of a certain condition. So 3 days is the calendar days. You can be more specific. If you want more or less, you can also include it here on the date. It already defaults for 5 p.m. that it will expire. Now you can also change it if you like to go 3 p.m., 6 p.m., a.m., whatever the case may be. These are all where you can manipulate the form to include the request of what your buyer's desires are. Okay. The initial deposit is a dollar amount. So whatever the deposit that the buyer feels comfortable with, right? oops, that's a little too much, 22,500 I was gonna put. Okay, that gives you a minimum of 3%. Now, when it comes to the initial deposit, many people have their own reasonings behind how much of a deposit to put. Well, it really depends on what the buyer's comfort level is, right? Because you're actually putting a deposit into escrow and that money is tied up in escrow until we either close the deal that goes towards the buyer's down payment and closing costs, or, right, or if it gets canceled, depending on the circumstances, that money will be refunded back to the buyer, or maybe possibly the seller, if there was a breach from the buyer, did not perform and therefore forfeiting some, if not all of the deposit to the seller. Okay, so the conversation when speaking with the buyer is to make sure that they feel comfortable with. And this can be countered as well. They may say, I only want to put $5,000, right, into escrow. Okay, but depending on the circumstances, remember, it's all based on the circumstance. If this property just came on the market and it's a hot property, and you really, truly, your clients truly want this property, then you got to be very aggressive on the price terms and condition. If the property has been on the market for 4 or 5 months, the seller may be lenient enough and they may just take whatever. So therefore you might be able to get away with a less amount of deposit. Does that make sense? Okay, good. All right. So D1 again, it goes into the initial deposit. Within 3 business days after acceptance, they'll wire the money. Okay. Now, the new form, they eliminated the section increased deposit. Before, you were able to add the additional increased deposit. Well, the new RPA has eliminated that section. So now if you check here, now an attachment will be added to it, which is the ADA form, the IDA form, which is the increased deposit addendum car form IDA form. Okay, so if you click here, it should populate the additional form if the buyer is looking to increase their deposit in the near future. Okay, circumstances can be around um, the buyer selling their property and they need the proceeds in order to purchase their new property that you're submitting an offer, but their property is about to close in 1 week and you just in the initial process of submitting this offer, they may not have the capital to put a substantial deposit. Therefore, they can say, look, we're willing to, in the near future, as soon as we close, increase the deposit from $100 to 22,500 as an example. So what you're saying is basically to the listing agent and the seller is, look, in good faith, we're going to include the additional means, but we just don't have it right this minute. It's in the future. Make sense?
Okay, so you're saying that, so is it in addition to the 22,500 that's already been?
Correct. Yeah, that's if you want to, or if your client wants to increase more than what the initial deposit is. Now, typically, 3% is the maximum that the seller can go after for monetary damages. Okay. The rest of that money, anything in excess of 3%, has to be returned back to the buyer. Okay. But let's just say, for the sake of today's class, that the buyer only put $5,000 as an earnest deposit, but needs to come in with the $18,000 in the near future. So that's where that increase would come into play.
To that point.
That's correct. That's correct. Okay, so far so good. All right, the loan amount. This is the amount that you're going to put here. So let's say that the buyer has 20%, right? 20% down to put towards the purchase of 750. So if we do reverse engineering, how do we calculate the amount, right? Well, you first start off with, what is 750 times 20%? That's $150,000, right? Now from the 750, we now reduce or subtract the 150, and that gives you a loan amount of 600,000. So that's where you're going to put here is 600,000. thousand. Okay, that puts you at 80% of the purchase price. So when the listing agent receives this, they're going to say 80% is what they're financing. So they're putting 20% towards their down payment. And remember, there's two components to this, right? And the bottom, if the top number, which is the purchase price, and the bottom number is the amount purchase price is not the same, then your arithmetic is off. And I'll explain to you in a little bit, okay? So it calculates and it also incorporates the deposit that you put into as well. And then what you need to bring into the into escrow will be the remaining balance. Okay. So again, the purchase price is $750. We got a 30-day escrow. The buyers are initial earnest deposit of $22,500, which is 3% of the purchase price. Their loan amount is $600,000, which is an 80% loan, right? It is a conventional, but if it's anything other than a conventional, then you can check if it's an FHA, VA, seller finance, or any other private funding. Hard money is an example. Then you would put here as part of the process. E2 goes into the additional finances. You know, if you're doing a second loan, seller carryback, then you can use E2 as that. But most transactions is usually first deed of trust. Nothing really surprising over that. But let's say it's a very unique transaction where the seller is willing to give some concessions towards the buyer to purchase this property, then you can use E2 as an example if the seller is doing a second finance, seller carryback. E3 goes into the occupancy type. If it's a primary residence, then it's already defaulted. If not, you can check if it's a secondary or if it's an investment property. Then, as I said earlier, this number up here must match the number down here. If there's something off here, if this number does not match the top, your arithmetic is off somewhere, okay? So it calculates the initial deposit, the loan amount, and this is what the balance of the down payment would have, wait a minute, balance of down payment, something is off here. We, let's see. Yeah, sorry, so 600, 1, 2, 3, let's see. No, something is off here.
20% of 750. So it should be,
Let's do the maths, because 750, 1, 2, 3 times 20%. Yeah, it's 150, so. The 80% is good, but for some reason, oh, here it goes. There it goes.
yeah.
Yeah, it got corrected. All right, so this is why you got double check, triple check. And here it is. Now the balance of the down payment of 127,500. Okay, that seems more reasonable. All right, so far, any questions regarding page 1 of the RPA? All right, let's go to page 2, and this is where the exciting part that I really like with CAR did was section G, G1, G2, and G3. All right, and I want to be very specific. And again, you may have some questions, and I'm here to answer. So G1 talks about seller credit to buyer. Okay, if you check this section, then that opens up the dollar amount. Okay, this is for closing cost. Okay, I want to repeat this. G1 is for closing costs. It doesn't talk about compensation to the buyer broker agreement that you have with the buyer. All right, so this is what you're asking the seller to pay towards your buyer's obligation for the loan, closing cost. Okay, if it's a dollar amount that you're going to put, then you're going to put it there. If you're not asking, then you leave it blank. Section G2 goes on additional seller credit terms. Does not include buyer broker compensation. So again, here you're not going to put anything in relations to your compensation. This is again, if you check here and you're asking for 10,000, Okay. What is the 10,000 for, right? This is where you're going to utilize this for that sake. All right. It could be for buyers' closing costs, non-allowables. It can also go towards, sometimes for request of repairs too as well. But for me, honestly, I think because we don't know the condition of the property, that's also a negotiating tool as you're already in escrow, because we don't know what to ask. We don't know the condition of the property, right? We're just going through the basic initiative of submission of the offer to get our offer considered and accepted. Make sense? That is correct. Yeah. All right. So G3, this is the new change that happened with the new car form is G3. And then we're going to reference what G3 on 18A section 2 and 18A3. We're going to talk a little bit about it. But here is when you're requesting from the listing agent and the seller, hey, we're asking that the seller pay us a commission. Okay. You need to check this section here. Seller payment for buyer's obligation to compensate buyer's broker. Buyer compensation affirmation. Seller agrees to pay out of the transaction proceeds. Here you're going to put what you're requesting, 2.5% of the final purchase price. And if applicable, you can also put a dollar amount. Okay. Now, this is the trick here. You see where it says if checked. Okay. You're going to put the amount of the 2.5%. So meaning, if your offer was 750, 2.5% is what? 18,750. Okay. You're going to put your commission dollar amount here. Okay. If checked, towards the obligation of the buyer to compensate buyer
Hey,
broker.
Simon, why would I check that box? Just curious.
Yeah, well, if you want to be more specific on the dollar amount.
Simon,
Yes,
I believe, I believe though, you wouldn't need to do it to actually calculate, to put the amount that equates to the percentage. That would be if you are agreeing to a different number other than that percentage, such as a flat fee of 10 grand or 20, whatever the flat fee number would be. That's where you would put that.
so meaning that
Thank you.
if you're asking less than 2.5%.
That is correct. That is correct. And that could be the difference. For instance, let us say the total compensation at 2.5 would be 25,000, but your buyer is competing, and at that point they may say, I'll tell you what, let's just, tell you what, I'm willing to pay 10 grand out of pocket. Let's see if the seller will give, will kick in 15 grand. Okay.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Thank you.
Yeah, so, okay, then we would just ask for 2.5% and leave it blank.
Correct.
So, yeah, thank you both for clarifying that, because now it makes sense. In this instance, it could be that the buyer may still want to pay you compensation, right? And on your BRBC form, you may have a 3%, right? Where you, in essence, you're not asking for the full amount. This is where you would calculate the difference. Okay, so then we're on the same page. You would put here the percentage, and if there's any modifications or anything, as Steve was saying earlier, then you can check this and then add the additional dollar amount. Now, buyers affirmatively represents that at the time this offer is made, buyer has a written agreement with the buyer broker that one is valid, number two covers the property, and number three provides for compensation for no less than the amount stated above. Okay, and that goes back to the BRBC, right? If there's a difference in what you are requesting from the buyer and this, you may have to either modify it, or your buyer may have to come in with the additional means to pay you your compensation. Does that make sense? Here's an example, right? You put on your BRBC, your buyer representation agreement, right? 3%, all right? But you're only asking the listing agent to provide you with 2.5% because the buyer has already agreed to pay you 0.5%. That's how you would, maneuver this. But let's just say that your amount on the BRBC is less than what you're asking the listing agent, then you would need to modify your BRBC to reflect what you're asking the seller for compensation. So let's say you have 1% on the buyer representation agreement that you're saying, hey, buyer, I want you to pay me 1%. But then you submit a request on the offer under section G3 for 2.5%. Well, you're going to have to either increase the BRBC to the 2.5%, or otherwise you're going to get the lesser amount, meaning that the seller may want to get a copy of your buyer representation agreement. They're going to see 1%. They're only going to offer you 1%.
If they ask for that, we have to give that to them?
Absolutely, yeah. Because remember, they're under no obligation to pay you compensation. This is now part of a negotiations. So meaning, one second, meaning that the seller has no reason to offer any type of compensation. Just like a request of repairs and asking for the seller to repair, replace, give you credit in lieu of the repairs or do a price reduction, the seller doesn't have to do that, right? Well, compensation is the same thing. The seller does not have to pay us a compensation. This is the reason we have the buyer representation agreement that reflects that the buyer is obligated. Now we're asking the seller to provide us with, the concessions, but if the seller says no, we have to rely on the buyer to pay us our commission. I hope that makes sense, Allison.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes.
That we have to change that in case we just said 1%. How do you go back and change it to 2 point? I mean, you write nothing.
No, so the form you're going to leave the same. So she's asking about if you have a 1% buyer representation agreement, how do we change it? Well, you either go back and do a modification of the buyer representation agreement, asking for an increase from 1% to 2.5%, because if the seller and the listing agent are requesting a copy of your BRBC, which they could, and you can decline it as well. You could say, I'm not going to give you a copy. Well, that's also showing proof to the seller that if you're not going to provide me with a copy of your BRBC or what your compensation is, the seller can decline in paying you compensation. They may agree to the terms, they may agree to the price, they may agree to the terms of the offer, but they can decline your compensation. Okay, so remember that. Remember, the MLS has removed the compensation. And prior to this NAR settlement that happened over the summer, now incorporates that anytime you're working with a buyer, you must include a buyer representation agreement, because the listing agent may, and I say may, they may ask for a copy or proof and receipt that you have an agreement with that buyer. Does that make sense? So going back to your question.
You have to do that before anyway.
But
You know,
But a lot of agents did not. A lot of agents were loose when it came to the buyer agreements. They wouldn't have them. So they would submit offers in hopes that their offer get considered. And once it gets considered, because the MLS already had a stamped compensation agreement, that would secure us from getting paid a commission. But remember, the MLS no longer has that. So now we're kind of in the mercy of the listing agent and the seller. Now, also bear in mind, folks, that on the MLS, there's a section that says that the seller is willing to pay concessions. It's either left blank, yes or no on it. So if it's left blank, my view of it is I'm open to submit a request for compensation. If it says yes, that they're willing to pay concessions, well, then I know that the seller is already flexible enough to pay something. And that concession can be closing costs, request of repairs, or compensation from the obligation of the buyer to pay you as the agent representing and negotiating the offer.
So the bottom line is for me is to play it safe in every regard. You would actually have to have the purchase agreement to stay whatever percentages that to the company need to receive that money, yes. Like, for example, with all these addendums and so forth, if it goes down to the buyer wants to see, well, what was the original agreement? Then you would go back to that, what form, what is that file, so to speak?
Yeah.
Stipulated on there that I'm safe.
Correct. So let's just say that the listing agent is asking for a copy, right? The copy would be your buyer representation agreement, your BRBC form. Okay, so if you initially had a 1%, right? You're gonna need to, if you're asking for an increase of 2.5% as part of your offer, you're gonna need to do a modification of the buyer representation agreement.
But what is the case scenario where, why would you do 1%? Why would you do it from the beginning?
I get it. I understand. Exactly. Why not just go with the basis that you're gonna charge the buyer 2.5? And the reason buyers do that is because they're afraid that the buyers will not sign an agreement or want to work with the buyer. Because they're saying, I'm gonna be paying you 2.5. You mean that I have to pay you almost $20,000 for you to help me find a house? I don't want to sign this agreement. And this is the reason agents are hesitant and says, look, I'm gonna do 1%. I agree with you. You know, I always say, go for the top, ask for 3%. And then have the conversation with the listing agent and the buyer. If they offer less than 3%, then, you know, I can either what do you call it? Not include the additional that you have to come in and pay me. I can just wash it and say, look, I'm okay with 2.5%. You don't need to pay me that 0.5%. That's your negotiating tool, okay? So you always want, in my opinion, when you're having a consultation with the buyer, is sit down and really know what your value is, right?
Yes.
And the standard has always, in my opinion, has always been 2.5, or 3%. Now, I get it. Why would you put 1%? Well, it was just an illustration, an example, but there's agents out there that are still putting 1%. But yeah, I would say go 2.5%, 3%. Okay. All right. Any questions on G3? All right. I want to go, before I continue with this, I want to go to section 18 of the RPA. All right. So let's go to 18 real quick. And I want you to see what it says on 18A. So we're at 14 now. Okay. So here, section 18, broker and agent compensation. 1, 2, 3. Okay. It says the following: timing of broker compensation. Seller or buyer or both agree to pay compensation to broker as specified. So remember, anyone can pay you compensation. It's not just one side. It's the buyer can pay some and the seller to make the deal work. Okay. But traditionally, it's always been the seller, right? But it's saying here that both can pay you compensation. As broker as specified in a separate written agreement between the broker and the seller or the buyer. Compensation is payable upon close of escrow, or if escrow does not close, as otherwise specified in an agreement between the broker and that the seller or buyer. Number 2, buyer representation. Seller payment to compensate buyer broker. Buyer affirmatively represents that the buyer at the time this offer is made has a written agreement with the buyer broker that 1 is valid, and 2 covers the property, and 3 provides for compensation for no less than the amount stated on paragraph 3G. Okay, so this is where you got to remember, if your BRBC is different, then you need to update it to reflect what you're asking. Okay, because if this number is off and your BRBC is not in alignment, then the seller can use that as a negotiation. Says, you only charge 1%, therefore I'm willing to give you 1%. Well, wait a minute, I asked for 2.5. Well, your BRBC says 1%. So you got to be very careful in how you navigate this.
So you do this before you give it to the seller?
Yeah, you always want to have a written agreement with the buyer. One, it just holds the position that you are have an agreement with the buyer. Absolutely. I'm not just going to submit an offer without securing our agency agreement.
Change the compensation. You ask the seller to pay 2.5%, but you had an agreement with the client 1%, for example. Now, when you do this, when you present this RPA for 2.5%, then you change it before you give it to the seller.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Instead of 4%.
that is correct. You want to do it before you submit an offer. Because the likelihood is that a savvy, experienced listing agent like myself, I'm going to know, and that's going to be part of my counter is, please provide me with a copy of the fourth or the fifth page of your BRBC. And if I see that it shows less than what you're offering, and when I present it to the seller, well, they have a 2%. Okay, then, I can say that as a negotiation, this is what the buyer's agent is willing to take. Even though if they're saying 2.5%, then I can go with the lower amount and say 2% instead of 2.5%. This is why you want to make sure you update it before your offer gets submitted, because again, not saying that all listing agents are going to ask for it. Some may not even ask for it, and they may just honor, and you may have 1%, and they still give you 2.5%. But the likelihood, if you have an experienced agent, they may come back and ask for that copy of that BRBC. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Number three, third-party beneficiary seller acknowledges and agrees that the buyer broker is a third-party beneficiary of this agreement and may pursue seller for failure to pay the amount specified in this agreement. So basically goes into the scopes of the compensation. Okay. Obviously B goes into the duties that you as a real estate agent. So let me go back again to the grid. Okay, so here again, G3. So this is one of the most significant components to the new purchase agreement, which is great. I never understood why they included the SBPP form. It was just an additional document that wasn't necessary. They shouldn't incorporate this from the very beginning. But obviously CAR got, probably complaints about it, and this, let's just incorporate it into the offer, which makes more sense because again, everything is in alignment, and the confusion, this is where I've seen a lot of confusion is someone did not submit the SBB form, and now it's like, we don't know if we're going to pay a compensation. This is why I like this now that it's all in the purchase agreement. Okay. Section H, 1, 2, and 3 just goes into the verification of cash. If it's a cash offer, then the attachment, you must within 3 days of the acceptance. Verification of down payment. Again, these are components that if the listing agent sees that your offer has a 20%, 25, 50% down payment, I want you to show me proof that the buyer has the means to do so. Just as an example, is a cash deal, right? I want to make sure that if you're offering 750, does the buyer have the means to, put down an all cash deal together? Okay.
That way the approval letter from the loan, company, from the bank, the pre-approval.
Well, the pre-approval is one if the buyer is getting a traditional loan. The proof of funds may be still asked by the listing agent to verify that the buyer has the means to, qualify for the loan and, whatever you're putting there, because again, the seller may look at 5 different offers, right? And make a distinguish of which of the offers is the strongest offer, because the number one goal for the seller is what? To close the deal, right? With no hiccups, no delays, right? So when having the conversation with the listing agent, they're going to see each of the 5 offers and determine, look, based on the price, terms, and condition, this is what this one has. This is what the second one, this is what the third one is, right? And then you do eliminations, right? Because if you have cash, conventional, FHA, and VA, you know that VA, even though God bless our military veterans, right? They're not the best desirable loans because there may be hurdles and challenges with it, right? As much as a federal government FHA loan. Not saying again that it's a bad thing, because I remember when I bought my first home, I used an FHA, right? So I understand the opportunity with an FHA. But if you have a cash and conventional with a stronger down payment, the likelihood that there's not going to be no appraisal issues, loan issues, then you kind of lean towards someone that is a stronger buyer than someone that may be kind of on the edge, and then we're 20 days in and the deal falls apart because they just don't qualify. So that's why you have to look at all those variables. All right, so section J goes into final verification, which is 5 days prior to close of escrow. The buyer has the ability to make sure they get a chance to see the property, to see if the property is still in the same condition as they originally submitted the offer, and that any request of repairs approved by the seller, that those repairs have been done. Okay, so within 5 days prior, the buyer has the ability to do a final walkthrough. K goes into an assignment request. Again, an assignment is different components, right? You're making an offer as your personal name, right? And then you want to assign it to your personal trust or your corporation or your LLC. Then the assignment must be done within 17 days from the time of acceptance. Okay. Now, if you're assigning it to someone other than yourself, that is not a part of the agreement. The seller has to approve it and agree to, but the seller may say no to that, you know, if you're assigning it to a different buyer or a different entity than yours. Okay. So I want to be clear on that, because we see a lot of investors wanting to assign it to other investors. Okay. And if you want more information, I would say go to paragraph 23, and it talks about the assignment request. All right, now we go into the contingencies. It's pretty self-explanatory. Most of, if not all of your contingencies are within 17 days to release. That includes loan, okay, appraisal, investigation of properties, informational access to the property, insurance, review of seller documents, preliminary title report, common interest, review of lease or liens, and all that's the COP. So these are the contingencies, right? If you are going to release a specific contingency right off the bat, then you must include the CR attachment here. So if you click here, it will populate the agreement, right? And then if there's a specific contingencies, let's say, for example, you're going to release the appraisal contingency because they're putting a substantial down payment. Let's say it's 750, but they're putting 650 and they're only financing 100,000. You know for a fact that the lender is not going to have a problem. Even if it doesn't appraise, they're going to give them the loan because they don't have that much risk involved, right? Because the buyer has put significant amount of money into it. So the buyer in a negotiating tool may say, I'm going to release the appraisal contingency because, you know, it's a small loan amount and I really truly want this property. Then you would populate the contingency removal form. Okay. Now, I also want to emphasize this section here under L2, appraisal. Okay. An appraisal contingency based upon appraised value at minimum of purchase price. Okay. If you check this, all right, what you're telling the seller is this: hey, if the appraised value comes in less than the 750, right, I'm willing to still come in with the difference to make this work, but I have a cap. That's where you're going to put whatever the cap is. So let's just say, for the sake of today, the offer is 750, right? But the buyer really truly wants this property. And the buyer may say, look, I'll buy the property even though it's less than what I offer. Then here you're going to put what is the maximum that the buyer is willing to come in with the difference. Okay. So in this case, what you're telling the seller is, look, if it doesn't appraise at 750, if it doesn't appraise at 740, if it doesn't appraise at 720, hey, if it doesn't appraise up to 700,000, okay, I'm willing to come in with the difference. If it appraises less than 700,000, then I'm out. Then I either use that as a negotiation, says, look, we made a 750. I'm coming in with 50,000 in addition to my down payment and closing costs and 50,000 to make this deal work. But the property appraised at 695. Is the seller willing to come down 5,000 to make this deal work? Because remember, the lender's not going to lend if it's not appraising. We would have to come in with the difference to make this deal work. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is your gap section here. Okay, what is the most that the buyer is willing to put into to make the deal work? This is what the buyer would have to come in with the difference.
These are just negotiations.
That's correct. That's correct. Okay. All right, let's see. Do we have any other questions? No. All right, so if there's no appraisal contingency, then obviously you would check that off, but that's what that means. All of this is pretty self-explanatory. Now let's go into the possession and time for performance, right? So time of possession basically means, hey, Mr. Seller, this is when we want the property, right? Either we want the property at the time of close of escrow, which is the notice of recording, right? So once we get from escrow, hey, congratulations, we've officially recorded, then what you're saying that at 6 p.m., right, we're going to be able to get the keys and the buyer's able to now go into the property and do what they need to do with the property. Start moving, start getting estimates for renovations, whatever the case may be. That's what time of possession is, right? Now you can also modify that if you want it before or after. It all really depends, right? Section M2 goes into seller occupying or vacant units, right? Close of escrow, if checked, it's basically the SIP, seller in possession. So if the deal means that the seller has to stay in possession after close of escrow, then this is again conversations you're having with the listing agent. And the listing agent is going to either put it on the MLS, put it on the counteroffer, or going to let you know, hey, Simon, by the way, the seller's going to need, they're moving out of state. And they're not going to be able to just from one day to the other, we're asking for an additional week or 2 weeks after we close to stay in possession of the property. And then after we'll release the keys to the buyer. And if the buyer's okay with it, then it's either 29 days or less. You would use the SIP 29 days or 30 days or more. Then you would use the RLAS form. It could be, yeah. It definitely can be monetary in this case, yeah. Everything is negotiable, right? Which can be the buyer's PITI, right? The buyer's principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. So once you know that amount, and let's say at 750, you're looking at $5,200. You divide $5,200 by 30, and that'll give you your daily rate. And if the seller's asking for 1 week, then you do 7 days times 125 as an example. That's where the seller will contribute to the buyers for the time that the buyer does not have possession to the property.
And that could be done through escrow or directly with the buyer.
That can be done through both escrow and also outside of escrow as well. Mostly it's done outside of escrow because the escrow company doesn't want to hold any additional means. By that time, transfer of ownership, the buyer is now the owner and the seller becomes a tenant, technically speaking. So now the buyer can go directly to the seller and says, okay, let's just work out a deal here. And this is how we're going to do it. Okay. All right, the next one goes into if the property is occupied by a tenant, right? Tenant occupied, then you would check the TOPA, okay? And this again is regardless if the tenant is staying or not staying on the property, you still need to include the TOPA for clarity and transparency. All right, section N as in Nancy goes into documents and timeframes to perform. And 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 go into seller delivery of documents. They have 7 days. Sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions from the time they have 5 days. Time to pay fees for ordering the HOA documents, it's 3 days from time of acceptance. Installation, smoke alarms, detectors, water bracing, they have 7 days after acceptance. And then evidence of representative authority, they have 3 days after acceptance. Okay, so the question is the evidence of that if there is a change from the buyer's name to maybe a trust, or the seller also in a trust situation, they're saying, hey, you know, if they're going to be switching it from a trust to a personal name, they have to give us the information within the time frame when that's going to happen. And again, if you go back into reference paragraph 32, it gives you a little bit more information on that. Okay. All right, the next page goes into items included and excluded. Okay, this is where you got to be very detailed and make sure that you're all on the same page when it comes to, because I see a lot of concerns and disputes and arguments, and this was supposed to be included, and you know, get clarity from the very beginning, right? And the way you get clarity is communications, folks, okay? So these are items that are included as part of the negotiation. All items specified are included in following if checked. So if the buyer is requesting certain items, then you want to make sure that they check it, right? If they are asking for the stove, okay, if they're asking for the dishwasher, if they're asking for security equipment, if they're asking for smart home control devices, you want to make sure. And then you also have this additional blank spaces if there's anything in specific that you want, okay? Maybe you want that classic 1955 Rolls Royce in the garage, right? I'm just kidding. But, you know, in essence, whatever the buyer's asking as part of the deal, you want to put it on here, right? It could be that the buyer has an electric vehicle and the seller has an electric vehicle, and they're asking for the charger system in the garage to be left there as a negotiation. Now, all this doesn't mean that it's going to stay, but it's a request from the buyer saying, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we're requesting these items to stay. It's all part of the negotiations. That's correct. All right, the next session goes into the allocation of cost. All right, so, you know, who is going to pay for what, right? And the standard are usually seller pay for this, right? The natural hazard disclosure Q1 goes into who's going to pay. Usually it's the seller. You could include the environmental if you like to. And then you want to know who is going to be the provider. If you click here, it already provides you with all these different NHD companies, okay? I don't have a preference. You can pick whoever you want. If you have a good relationship, you can say, hey, we're going to go with my NHD as an example, right? Optional wildfire disclosure. Okay, this is optional. If the property does not fall under the wildfire, then you can leave that blank. But if you know it does fall under that, then yes, you want to check here that the seller would be paying for it. All right, any additional reports? Again, I want to stress that the less you put, the better you're at, because you don't want underwriter to question it and ask for additional reports. So I see that people put termite report there, they'll put home inspection report. I get it. But that's already part of the buyer's due diligence period. They can do whatever they want within the time frame to do anything to satisfy themselves to the overall condition of the home. Don't put it here, because the minute you put it here, that red flags the underwriter, because they get a copy of this and they're going to say, oh, I see that the buyer requested a termite. And what if that termite is really bad? Right? And the seller is not going to do the termite, or the home inspection is really bad. You don't want, again, the underwriter to see that, because they may flag it and says, well, the condition of the property is in bad condition. Their biggest concern is that the buyer will not do the work if the seller is not going to at least take care of it, and they'll not continue making the mortgage payment. And now they have an asset that is not generating the investment that they gave, right? So again, I want to stress, leave it blank. Okay, but if you have to, then by all means, this is the reason these blanks reports are here for, right? What reports? Who is paying for those reports? Q4, Q5, and Q6 go into the smoke detectors. Typically, the seller pays for the smoke detectors. Government required point of sale, inspections and report, okay? This goes into kind of the city inspections, county inspections, or even state inspections that a property may fall under. Who is responsible to pay these point of sale reports? Okay, these are just inspection. Is it the buyer going to pay for it or the seller? Typically, it's always the seller that pays for it. Okay, so then you would check the seller to pay that. Government required points of, excuse me, the seller would pay government required point of sale corrective. So if after they do the inspection and there is some corrections, who is going to take care of those corrections? Is it the buyer will do it after close of escrow, or is it the seller prior to close of escrow that'll take care of those, right? We have to come to a distinguishing who's going to take care of it if the buyer is requesting, any of these government required point of sale and clearance. Section Q7 goes into escrow fees, all right? Always want to go both, okay, or each pay their own. And the reason is because when you go both, you're typically splitting it 50-50, right? Well, the buyers incur more cost than the sellers. So why would a buyer or seller go 50-50, right? So in essence, you want to pay each their own because the seller usually is less than the buyer fees. Okay, so I would say let the buyer pay their own fees and let the seller pay their own fees. And then escrow holder, you want to typically put seller's choice, or you can also, I've seen this done many times, is put in the escrow company that you want. Okay, and I've seen it. I want Pacific Coastline escrow as an example, or seller's choice. Because the seller or the listing agent may be out of area and the property is in your neighborhood, they may be like, we don't know of anyone, we'll go with the buyer's choice, right? And you may have that conversation with the listing agent, says, look, I have a great escrow officer. The prices are pretty reasonable. It's here locally. We can get it done, right? The listing agent may be compelled and says, look, not a problem. Let me talk to the seller and see if the seller is willing to do so, right? So I would throw that in there. Put in your escrow company plus seller's choice as an alternative, right? Or just put seller's choice, in my opinion. Title insurance is typically paid by the seller. Again, seller's choice, or if you have your preferred title company, then you can ask your preferred title company or seller's choice. All right, so county tax fee, typically seller on city tax fees. If the property falls under HOA, then you would say HOA to be paid by the seller, okay? Or you can choose the buyer or both, depending on the circumstances. Private transfer fees, again, very rare. Certain neighborhoods have private transfer fees, especially like high-end areas like Beverly Hills, Bel Air. The west side, there's patches and areas that they have additional private transfer fees because you live in a very unique neighborhood. Then that's something that you can ask the escrow company or the title company if there's any additional private transfer fees. Q16 and 17 goes into any additional costs, you can put, and then Q18 goes into the home warranty. Who's going to pay? Typically the seller. You can put a dollar amount. I would check the pamphlet, depending on what type of plan you're getting, and then put that the seller is willing to pay up to $750. And again, who is the provider, right? Old Republic, Fidelity, whoever you want. Other terms is obviously what additional terms you want to include as part of the negotiations. Typically here, like other terms, is if you're an agent representing yourself or representing a family member, you have to divulge that, you may be involved in it or your license. You're going to put that additional information on here as well. The next page goes into the property addendums and advisories. Again, pretty self-explanatory. There's not really much here, that only if there's specifics to the property, such as if the property has a septic tank, okay, if the buyer or the seller are doing a 1031 exchange, if the seller is whatchamacallit, if it's a manufacturer home, then you would check the appropriate. And here's again that TOPA. If the tenant is planning to remain, or if the tenant is not, you still need to include the TOPA. All right. And then the rest of the stuff, for the sake of time, guys, I'm not going to go into it. It's pretty self-explanatory, and the best practice for me and for you is read the contracts, right? I can literally spend hours and hours just going through all this. This is why it's important to go through the grid. And if you don't understand what that paragraph means, then look at what the grid says in the paragraph and then go and see what that's what I like about this new, it references, because prior RPAs did not have that. You had to go through all of the forms and then read and read and read. Oh, there's the paragraph that says that. Here, they made it very simplistic, okay? And again, I'll share where that grid is, right? It's all this section here. Okay, so if there's anything in here that you want to know about, just go into this section. So let me just use one as an example again. So let's say the assignment as an example, right? Remember we were talking about the assignment. So it's like, what does an assignment mean? Go to paragraph 23. So then you go to 23, go. Okay, where's 23? I just passed it. Boom, here it is. This is all that talks about the assignment, right? Definitions, if you want to know what definitions are, then you just go to paragraph 30, I believe, or 25 here. Definition of instructions. Okay, what does an acceptance mean? What does an agent mean? What does an agreement mean? What does this as is mean? What is an authorized agent? What are car forms? What's close of escrow? What's a copy? What's a counting days? So it gives you all of the references to that, right? And again, the best policy is always read these contracts, get a better understanding, like even like liquidated damage provisions, mediation arbitrations, what does it mean? Title and investing, right? If you want to know a little bit more of what title and investing mean, here's paragraph 13 that goes into A, B, C, D, E, F, G. 14B is the contingency removal, right? It goes into, okay, what are the provisions that if the buyer wants to back out of the deal, right? Well, within 14, under paragraph 14B, it talks about request of repairs and contingency removal or canceling escrow. So again, the more you practice, folks, the better you get to understand how to maneuver and how to negotiate this. If the buyer has to back out because the property is in really bad condition, the buyer may ask for a seller's concession for repairs credit, and the seller comes back and says no, then you know that that'll give you the opportunity to cancel and then retain your deposit because you have not released all your contingencies, and they'll go find another property to submit an offer. Okay? Pretty self-explanatory. All right, team. With that being said, it is 11:32. I went 2 minutes over my time. Any final thoughts, questions, or concerns? Was this helpful?
Yes, absolutely. Always. You're
Awesome.
always helpful.